Hello. My hair looks crazy. I don't want to talk about it. I thought it would be fun today to talk about some bookish pet peeves. Now, I was originally going to do bookish hot takes because I think those videos are really fun, but I've got to be honest with you. I don't know which of my takes are hot and which of them aren't. I don't know. I consume a lot of book internet, but I still feel like I don't really know like if certain things I think are unusual or not, and I didn't want to post a video called like bookish hot takes and have them all be like completely lukewarm. So instead I thought I'd just do pet peeves, right? And just talking about things I generally don't like, either in books or like surrounding the book community. And then I thought you guys could comment some of your pet peeves below, and maybe I could do another video where I react to your guys' pet peeves. So let me know what your pet peeves are down below, and I'm gonna tell you mine here. My first one I've already talked about multiple times, and that's how you know it's a real pet peeve. I hate it when there's an enemies to lovers and the reason that they're enemies is bad. And I use the word bad in general because I think it can be bad in different ways. It can be bad because it's stupid, but it can also be bad because it's like too extreme and then it's like hard to forgive. For a long time, I was very forgiving of contemporary romance authors trying to do enemies to lovers because I thought it would be really hard to do. To come up with a reason why people could be enemies that's like reasonable enough that the story's interesting, but not so extreme that you're like, how are they ever going to resolve this, or that you feel like you can't forgive one of the parties. But I actually recently read a book called At First Spite that I did not love, I'll be honest, but I'll save my overall review for when I do my next wrap up. One of the good things I will say about it is that the reason they were enemies was really good, and not only was it really good, but it kind of showed me how you can do this in contemporary romance, and now I have a lot higher of expectations because it's always kind of bothered me. But before I'd be like, oh, but it'd be hard, and now I'm like, no, it's not that hard. Actually, it's not that hard. It's not hard at all. The premise of At First Spite is that, I forget what their names are, but there was this couple and they were engaged, and then the brother of the guy convinces him to break up with his fiance, and so the fiance obviously hates him, and the romance is between the fiance and the brother of this one guy. And on the surface you're like, fuck that guy, like he just convinced his brother to dump her and now he wants to date her like crazy. But the context of original engaged couple being together was that they'd only known each other like 3 months. They'd only seen each other in person a few times, and the plan was for her to be financially dependent on him for like a year-ish while she figured out where she wanted her career to go. Now, I understand that life situations can get people down, you know what I mean? So I'm not saying that needing support from your partner is a bad thing. All I'm saying is that if one of my siblings came to me and said, yo, I met this person 3 months ago, I've seen them in person a couple of times, we're getting married, and I'm going to be financially supporting them, you know, I might have a little like, are you sure about this moment? Are you sure this is the best idea? Like, I don't think you can really fault the brother knowing that whole situation with like not really wanting the wedding to happen. And like, did he go really above and beyond trying to convince his brother to call off the wedding? Yes, but it's a book, right? But I when you find out like the context of the engagement, it's a little bit more like, oh, okay, I can see where he was coming from, and it's just kind of like a bad situation overall. And that's what I'm saying. I think the key to enemies to lovers is putting the characters in a bad situation where both of their actions are understandable, but it's also completely understandable why the other person is upset. Because you get why she doesn't like him, like he broke up her and her fiance, but at the same time you can understand why he didn't want the wedding to happen. So when you look through both of their eyes, you're like, yeah, I can see it. I don't think anybody is really a bad person here. I think it's just something we have to resolve. And that's what leads to the interest in the story. If the reason they're enemies is just like a miscommunication or it's like kind of dumb or whatever, as a reader, what is there to interest us? Like, we already know that the story is going to end with them being together if it is a romance. So you're already fighting against the reader kind of knowing what happens at the end. And the interest is in finding out how that happens. And so if the reason they're enemies is something really goofy or it's just a miscommunication, then you know they're just going to find out whatever information they need to find out, and then everything's going to be fine. And so it's not like interesting for the reader. But on the flip side, you want to like all your characters, so you can't make it so extreme. So that's why I'm just generally of the mindset that enemies to lovers works so much better in fantasy settings, because you can just invent a war. Almost like a Romeo and Juliet situation where it's like, you're a part of this group and you're a part of this group, and these groups don't like each other, and so you don't like each other right when you meet. Or maybe you're like both fighting for the same thing, and so you hate each other, but then you decide to work together. You see what I'm saying? Like, I just feel like there's so much more flexibility in fantasy romance. Create situations where people would be enemies that like make sense and aren't dumb. That's all I'm saying. So that's pet peeve number 1. Number 2 is car accidents. This is such a personal gripe. It really is. But I am just such a firm believer that there is essentially one single story in the history of humanity that had a car accident in it, where the car accident was actually like a good and useful like furtherance of the theme and the message of the book. And that's the car accident that happens in No Country for Old Men. Outside of this book, there has never ever been a good car accident in literature, and I will die on that hill. I actually will not die on that hill, because you guys might be aware of another situation like No Country for Old Men. So if it's similar to this, then it's fine. Car accident is kind of the term I'm using to capture when authors use like a random event to drive the action of the climax specifically. To me, if you feel like you need some kind of car accident or some kind of random event to come in to add tension to the climax, and you probably didn't build your tension super well through the narrative, you've like got to have something come in and happen that the reader couldn't have expected, or that the characters couldn't have expected, in order to drive the tension of the finale. And unfortunately, this happens in romance a lot, because the whole like, oh, I thought I lost you thing wakes people up to realize how much they care about somebody. And so this can very commonly be some kind of accident, somebody getting hurt, some kind of car accident that's like random, is a relatively common ending to a lot of romance novels, or certainly was for a long time. And it just bothers me, because again, it's like you didn't build the tension enough between the characters if they can't drive the romance on their own. There are other ways for someone to have the realization that they love someone and want to be with them. And I just feel like it's such a tired trope, and it's hard to foreshadow. And usually, if you find it in a story, it's a marker that the overall story doesn't have very good tension. Why is No Country for Old Men different? I'm so glad you asked. The theme of No Country for Old Men is all about like chaos, and how even the person that you think has the most control of a situation doesn't necessarily. And so the car accident is intended to be a random event in the book, but the purpose of it is to show that there is always an element of chaos in every story. So as much as you think everything's planned out to a T, everything's going to be executed perfectly, and the character that's in perfect control is in perfect control the whole time, boom, car accident. There is this random event that created this element of chaos that made it go not that character's way, right? That's how you use a car accident or a random event to like further the actual theme of the novel. If you're not doing that, then a random event really, in my opinion, isn't a good thing to include in a story. Again, these are just personal pet peeves. I'm not saying I'm like the arbiter of taste. I could be incorrect about these things, but that's just my own personal opinion. Another narrative-based pet peeve of mine, this is a common one, and this is where I'm saying like I don't think some of these things are hot takes. Like I think it's pretty common to think this, but you still see it all the time in books, and it's when a character's bad actions are like justified through showing their background and their trauma, as opposed to just contextualized that way. Like there's a difference between contextualizing someone's actions and justifying them. And I think oftentimes what ends up happening, especially in romances with dark heroes, is those dark heroes' actions will be justified by their trauma, and there's no expectation that they're going to change or become better. Kind of a forced acceptance on the partner to be like, well, if I want to be with this person, I have to put up with the fact that they're like this because they had all this trauma, and I'm understanding to that. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be understanding of people's trauma in real life, but that has to go hand in hand with a desire to work on it. It's a middle ground. It's a compromise, right? I can be understanding that this is difficult for you, and I can do what I can to help, to not trigger you, all of that kind of stuff. At the same time, the partner should still be working on processing their trauma so that so much of their behavior isn't driven by it. And that's what I think gets missed a lot of the time. And it is just like a heavier subject to cover in romance novels, but this is where I just always go back to, if you don't want to cover something properly, then you shouldn't introduce it to begin with. And maybe that's like its own pet peeve, so we'll talk about that in a minute. But going back to this, I just think it's bad messaging, and I think a lot of people are like, well, where's the harm? They're just books, like suspend your disbelief. And I'm like, yes, I agree with that. Now that I'm 25 years old and I can read books and enjoy them and then step away and fully functionally understand that I do not want a man to act like that. Not to sound like a boomer, but like there's merit to the fact that like young girls are reading these books during an impressionable time in their lives. We wonder why there's so many women who are so okay with putting up with men's like whack actions, and yet as soon as a woman like missteps even a little bit, she'll just get dumped by a man out of nowhere. It's like there's no forgiveness for women and there's all this forgiveness for men, and I think it's a chicken or an egg thing. I don't know which happened first or if they evolved together, but I don't think we're helping when we continue to like push these things in our narratives. I'm not saying you can't have someone start out in a story being kind of not the best person and still write a romance about them, but you have to show the growth. You can't just justify what they're doing by saying like, well, they went through this experience when they were young and it was hard. That's great. That contextualizes their behavior. But if you're writing a romance about them and you want to show them as this romance hero, then you gotta show them changing a little bit to be better, in my opinion. If you're not writing a romance, I mean, have at it. People don't have to be good people, and you can write a story about someone that's not a good person. That's totally fine. People don't have to grow and change, you know? But if you're writing a romance and you're trying to like sell somebody as a romantic hero and you're trying to show like a grand relationship that people want to fantasize about, then I think there's a bit of a responsibility to not do that. So moving on to the thing I mentioned in the middle there, it's when romance authors throw dark themes into their books and then don't do them justice. Because to me, it's just like, why? Like, if you want to write a dark romance, you absolutely can. There are a lot of dark romances out there. You can cover dark topics, but you have to cover them well. Like, you can't just wrap yourself in this blanket of like, oh, well, I'm writing a romance. You have to be careful of the way you're representing things. You have to do your research. You have to do your due diligence. Like, you chose to write a novel. Writing a novel isn't easy. You chose to incorporate those themes. You can write a romance that does not involve these heavier themes, and then there is no pressure on you to execute it properly. But if you are going to choose to incorporate some of these really heavy themes into your book, then you are opening yourself up to the criticism that you did not cover it properly. It drives me batty. It drives me batty because you see this so often. You see this so often with authors. You see it with people covering books. Even I think at times have said like, oh, well, it's a romance. It's just supposed to be fun. So maybe I'm being too critical. But no, I'm not being too critical because you were the one who chose to put that super heavy topic in your romance. So if you chose to put it in there, then I'm allowed to have an opinion about it, and you don't get to be upset about that. Actually, you get to be upset about anything. I'm validating your feelings. You can be upset, but that doesn't make the criticism unfair. Like, you can't just say that criticism's unfair because the book was just meant to be fun. Well, if it's just meant to be fun, then don't put that kind of stuff in there. Anyway, this brings me to a more book community pet peeve. This is not unique to the book community, nor is it a new conversation, nor is my take unique. And yet I'm going to sit and tell you about it because I have a microphone. Any argument that you like can't criticize artists in general drives me batty. You chose to put your work out into the world, you know? If you don't agree with someone's criticism, then absolutely debate them. There's such a like elitist, condescending, you just didn't get it, or you don't know enough about this author, you don't know enough about the context, you're judging it in isolation, you didn't read the whole rest of the series, like how can you judge the first book when you haven't read the whole rest of the series? Like basically arguing that someone's criticisms are not fair because all they did was consume the media. It's like enraging when I see people say this because that artist created a piece of media meant to be consumed on its own. Dare I say it, they wrote a book that's meant to be picked up off the shelf and read. Why should I have to know that author's backstory to understand the book? I feel this way, so maybe I'm setting myself up to get doxxed, but I don't care. It has to be said. Someone has to be brave enough, okay? This is exactly what's happening with the Swifties right now. People are allowed to not like Taylor's new album. They are allowed to not like it because they don't get the references to her life. Because she wrote a pop album and she put it out into the world. And so if I want to be able to just listen to a pop album and enjoy it and not have to know this singer-songwriter's literal entire life story in order to understand the meaning and the context behind each of these songs, then I am allowed to want that. And I am allowed to not like the album if she did not give me that. I don't have to become a Taylor Swift historian to judge whether or not I subjectively like her new album. It's crazy to me because there's all these Swifties out there being like, well, everybody else in the world just doesn't get it because they don't have a Twitter account that's acting as like a active ongoing biography for the celebrity they've never met. People are allowed to listen to the album in isolation and have an opinion on it. You can disagree with their opinion. That's fine. This whole like you can't judge it unless you know her whole history, and like the people who don't like it, it's just because they don't get it because they haven't done the research. I'm not getting homework from a musician. Okay, I'm not doing a dissertation on this person's life just to listen to this album. And it's ridiculous to think that anybody should have to do that to have an opinion. That is obviously an extreme example, but this pops up in small forms all over the literature world. The only version of it that I am okay with, I guess, is like cultural differences in storytelling. So different cultures have evolved to tell stories in different ways. And so stories are told differently. And that's why sometimes translated work doesn't do as well in other countries, because the stories are just kind of like told differently, which is a subject that I find absolutely fascinating, that essentially the stories that you grow up hearing impact what you find entertaining in stories. While the act of storytelling is universal across cultures, the way that storytelling happens is not universal. I find that absolutely fascinating. And so I can understand like wanting to give a little bit of context to the culture a story came from. Like if someone reads a book and they're like, it was kind of missing like a climax. And you're like, well, that author's Chinese, and in Chinese literature, they often use more of a 3-act structure than a 5-act structure. So the idea of like a traditional climax, the way it happens in America, like doesn't necessarily apply. You know, like some of those conversations I think are just interesting to have. Also like understanding the history of a country, like if somebody's writing a historical fiction like about a different country and there's like references and there's kind of this understanding that you understand the historical importance of this as a part of reading the book, like that kind of stuff I completely understand. But outside of that, an artist writes a book and you pick up that book and you read it, and a lot of times you don't have context. And to argue that just like a run-of-the-mill off-the-shelf book needs the context in order to be able to determine whether or not you subjectively like it or not, I think is a little goofy. Now, doing objective reviews, if you want to start a book channel, if you want to do like, you know, Instagram or whatever, I mean, you can review based off of whatever you want. You can do subjective reviews. But if you want to do a more like objective analysis, then, you know, you've seen me say like, well, we understand that this is what the author was trying to do, so now we're judging how successful they are. But that's me trying to step away from what my subjective opinion is, right? That's me trying to say like, my subjective opinion might be one thing, but maybe this author was trying to execute something that I don't like very much. So I'm not going to like the book because I don't like what they were trying to do, but that doesn't mean that they weren't successful in what they were trying to do. Those are different things, but we have to separate them out as different things. Like if you subjectively like something and I subjectively don't like something, you don't get to tell me that my opinion is invalid because I don't understand the context, because I haven't done extensive research on Taylor Swift's life. You see what I'm saying? Which brings us to yet another pet peeve of mine, which is going to seem contradictory to what I just said, but it isn't, and I'm going to explain to you why. I hate it when people don't like a genre and then they read a book in that genre and then they say that the book is bad. Or if we could consider an alternate possibility, you just don't like that genre. For example, I'm not a really big fan of horror. I don't read a lot of horror. I especially don't like body horror. I'm queasy, I'm squeamish, I'm a little bitch. I do not want to read about people's bodies being like pulled apart. I don't want to read about like intestinal worms. I don't even, just talking about this is grossing me out a little bit. This is also true in movies. My friends are aware of this. They often do not recommend me movies because they are too gory and they know I would not like them. This is a fact that I know about myself. I picked up like an extreme horror or whatever they call those things, I can 100% guarantee you I would not enjoy that reading experience. Would it then be fair for me to go give that book like a 1-star review? Personally, I don't think so, because I'm not the demographic for that book. If you like horror, maybe it is a good book, but I don't like horror, so subjectively, I'm not going to like it. That's again why I was saying with my last pet peeve, sometimes you got to pull your subjective opinion out of it and look at it objectively. And for the books I review for this channel, I try to do that. I try to pull my opinion out of it and say, what was the author trying to do? Were they successful? Well, this author was trying to write a super gory horror novel. Were they successful in that? Absolutely. Am I the best judge of how successful they are in that? No, because I don't read a lot of horror. But the reason it bothers me is because we see books getting recommended, especially on like Book Talk, and these are like Wattpad style, like fan fiction-y almost romances. And people who like to read like deep contemporary fiction are picking up these books and then being like, how are these books so popular? Book Talk is stupid. It's ruining reading, blah, 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 blah. It bothers me because a lot of people who don't read romance that often pick up a romance and are just like, this is bad, because they don't typically like romances. And that's why I'm saying this almost seems like it contradicts my other point, because I was saying you shouldn't have to have the context to appreciate something, but it's different, because then I'm talking about like pop culture context, right? I'm talking about understanding like the history of a celebrity's life in order to enjoy what seems to be an autobiography about a few years of their life. If it's supposed to be an autobiography, then I should understand it just by listening to it. I shouldn't have to go get other context in order to understand it. And it's not fair to put that expectation on people and say that they're not allowed to say they didn't like it if they don't have that kind of context. With this point, what I'm saying is I don't think it's fair to subjectively judge works of fiction that are in genres that you don't like. Like if you know you don't like a genre and you read a book and you didn't like it, then you don't like that genre. That's what that means. It doesn't necessarily mean the book is bad or not. You don't really have the ability to judge it. If you don't read a lot of romance and then you read a romance and you don't like it and you get on TikTok and you're like, this book is stupid and these people are stupid for recommending this book and I hate them, that's a you issue, dude. Why did you pick that book? If you don't like this genre, you weren't gonna like the book. You never had a chance with it. Why even read it? Not just why even read it, but why read it and then like make a whole review talking about how bad it is. If it's not your cup of tea, it's not your cup of tea. Leave it alone. That extends to people criticizing Taylor Swift. Like there's fair criticisms of this new album, don't get me wrong, but if people are just like, oh, I hate pop music and so I hate Taylor Swift, like, yeah, I disagree with that too. If you don't like pop music, you weren't gonna like the album. I hope I made it clear what the difference there is. Anyway, hello everyone. I got cut off when I was filming yesterday and I didn't get the chance to actually do the outro. So here it is. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. And let me know down below what your pet peeves are so that I can maybe do a video reacting to those because I think that would be fun. Have a great rest of the day and I will see you guys in the next one.